What if the silver screen's most luminous moments were lit by something far more intoxicating than talent? Behind the flawless smiles and iconic one-liners, a cloud of smoke drifted through Hollywood's golden age, and we're not talking about cigarettes. While the rest of America was taught that a single puff could destroy your soul, inside studio gates, the biggest names were passing joints between takes. One legendary tough guy got arrested so publicly it should have ended him, yet his career exploded. A jazz genius wrote letters to the president demanding legalization while high on his own private stock. A director locked himself in an editing room for 3 days straight, emerging only after a fog of marijuana had birthed a masterpiece. And an actress so squeaky clean, she was America's sweetheart, harbored a private ritual so carefully guarded that even her daughter never suspected a thing. These aren't rumors whispered decades later. These are the documented, studio-covered, career-defining secrets of Hollywood's most prolific cannabis users. The lights, the camera, the action, all of it soaked in a haze that Tinseltown spent millions to hide. And once you know who was secretly stoned while making cinema history, you'll never watch these films the same way again. She was the girl next door, the unsinkable darling who tap-danced into America's heart in Singin' in the Rain. So when you picture Debbie Reynolds, you probably imagine wholesome energy, not a carefully concealed cannabis habit that spanned years without a single public whisper. That's exactly how she wanted it. The discovery happened during the grueling shoot of How the West Was Won. Exhausted, anxious, and crumbling under the pressure of being everyone's moral compass, Reynolds tried marijuana for the first time, and something clicked. But unlike the stars who flaunted their vices at Hollywood parties, she retreated into absolute secrecy. She smoked alone. She developed meticulous masking techniques. Her justification wasn't fear of scandal alone. It was a fierce protectiveness toward the children and families who adored her. As she confided to a close friend, "My public is children and their parents. I won't betray their trust by getting caught, but I won't betray myself by giving up something that helps me cope with this pressure cooker." The closest she came to exposure was during rehearsals for The Singing Nun, when director Henry Koster noticed an uncharacteristic calm settling over his usually high-strung star. Suspecting the truth, he confronted her privately. Reynolds didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye and proposed a pact. What he suspected stayed buried, and in return, she would deliver the performance of a lifetime. Koster, stunned by her candor, agreed. He would later call her the most functional marijuana user I've ever encountered in this town of excess. What makes Reynolds' story remarkable isn't just the secrecy, it's the iron discipline. While Pierce spiraled into addiction, she drew rigid lines. Never before caring for her children. Never before stepping on set. Her cannabis use wasn't a descent into chaos. It was a pressure valve, meticulously controlled. Her daughter Carrie Fisher, who knew chaos intimately, later wrote with almost bewildered admiration, "Mom was better at hiding her vices than anyone in Hollywood. She didn't just have a public face and private face. She had separate lives that never intersected, each perfect in its own way." This was the ultimate double performance, America's sweetheart by day, solitary stoner by night. And while Reynolds' secret held, another star's secret exploded into headlines so spectacular they nearly burned his entire career to the ground. If Debbie Reynolds was Hollywood's hidden stoner, Robert Mitchum was its walking scandal. Those sleepy, heavy-lidded eyes weren't acting. They were a permanent feature of a man who refused to pretend he was anything other than what he was. In 1948, the facade shattered entirely. While filming Rachel and the Stranger, police raided a small Hollywood Hills party and found Mitchum passing a joint with starlet Lila Leeds. The arrest made national headlines, "Movie bad man caught with marijuana." Mitchum was sentenced to 60 days in county jail, and newspapers gleefully declared his career a smoldering wreck. Publicly, Mitchum played the penitent sinner, telling reporters, "This is the bitter end of everything." But RKO studio boss Howard Hughes saw opportunity where others saw catastrophe. Instead of dropping his star, Hughes orchestrated a masterful redemption campaign, painting Mitchum as a remorseful man seeking a second chance. Behind the scenes, the remorse was non-existent. When asked years later about his jail stint, Mitchum delivered one of the most casually defiant quips in Hollywood history. It was just like Palm Springs, only the food was worse. Crew members from later films would recall him vanishing between takes for cigarette breaks that left his eyes noticeably redder. His appetite for marijuana hadn't diminished one bit. Here's the twist no one saw coming. The arrest that should have killed his career made him a bigger star. His dangerous, untamable reputation electrified audiences. Director Otto Preminger later admitted, Robert didn't need to act like a bad boy. He was one, and audiences could sense it. The man who went to jail for cannabis emerged as cinema's ultimate rebel, his box office appeal stronger than ever. It was a stunning irony. Hollywood's biggest drug bust became its most effective publicity stunt. But while Mitchum was shrugging off jail time, a musician with a trumpet and an unshakable daily ritual was about to make the White House his personal suggestion box. The haunting voice that graced countless Hollywood soundtracks belonged to a woman who used marijuana to steady her nerves before facing the microphone. But Billie Holiday's story isn't about escape. It's about how the federal government weaponized her cannabis use to destroy her. During a 1947 scoring session for a major studio film, Holiday stunned orchestra members by smoking 3 joints in rapid succession, then delivering her vocal in a single flawless take. The sound engineer later marveled, any other singer would have been unconscious. Billie just closed her eyes and gave us the most haunting performance I've ever recorded. This supernatural tolerance became part of her mystique, but it also painted a target on her back. Federal Bureau of Narcotics Commissioner Harry Anslinger personally targeted Holiday, using her marijuana habit as a pretext for relentless harassment. In 1949, when Holiday was contracted for a major film appearance, Anslinger threatened the producers with devastating negative publicity, effectively blacklisting her from Hollywood. What's most stomach-churning is the industry's response. Studio heads who attended cannabis-friendly parties themselves refused to defend her. Years later, one producer admitted anonymously, "We all knew the marijuana charges were just an excuse. Half the white stars in Hollywood were smoking the same stuff at the same parties we attended, but we stood by silently while Billie was sacrificed." This grotesque double standard, cannabis tolerated in white stars, career ending for a black woman, exposed Hollywood's deepest hypocrisy. Holiday's persecution wasn't about drugs, it was about control. And while she was being sacrificed, a rotund genius was locking himself in an editing room, filling it with so much smoke that the studio would eventually break down the door. Orson Welles' appetite for cannabis was as towering as his talent, and just as impossible to contain. The boy wonder who revolutionized cinema with Citizen Kane didn't dabble. He elevated marijuana to an essential creative fuel, smoking constantly while sculpting his masterpieces. The most legendary episode came during post-production on The Magnificent Ambersons. Welles locked himself in the editing room for 72 straight hours, sustained by what his assistant described as a constant fog of marijuana smoke so thick you could barely see the screen. When RKO executives finally broke down the door, they found Welles asleep on the floor, surrounded by brilliant edits and burnt roaches. This very incident contributed to the studio's decision to seize and re-edit the film, creating one of cinema's greatest tragedies. Welles refused to hide his vice. He once told a shocked reporter, "Marijuana helps me see beyond conventional structures. Hollywood thinks in straight lines. I think in spirals and curves." This unapologetic honesty extended to his radio work. A performer later revealed that Welles smoked before the infamous War of the Worlds broadcast, and that dreamlike quality in his voice that terrified America came directly from the marijuana. Hollywood could tolerate secret users, but Welles' refusal to be a hypocrite became another strike against him. Studio head Jack Warner declared, "Welles has 2 problems. He won't follow orders and he won't hide his vices." The combination made him unbankable. In his final years, Welles observed bitterly, Hollywood forgives everything except honesty about the tools that fuel its creativity. Yet while Welles was being exiled for his openness, another director was openly smoking on set and getting away with it because his films made too much money to stop. If Orson Welles was punished for visibility, John Huston proved that box office success could buy near total immunity. The legendary director behind The Maltese Falcon and The African Queen maintained a strict daily routine, direct in the morning, smoke marijuana during his midday break, and return to set with what he called his enhanced perspective. Humphrey Bogart once remarked that working on a Huston film meant learning to communicate with a man whose mind was operating on a completely different wavelength after lunch. Studio executives looked the other way because Huston's films printed money. The most outrageous examples came during the filming of The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Deep in the Mexican mountains, far from studio oversight, Huston directed entire sequences while smoking openly. His father, Actor Walter Houston initially objected, but eventually joined in, creating what crew members described as the most relaxed set in Mexico, with father and son giggling between takes like schoolboys. Screenwriter Truman Capote revealed an even more astonishing pattern. During their collaboration, Houston would smoke a joint, stare at the pages for an uncomfortably long time, then suddenly cross out entire scenes and rewrite them on the spot. The frustrating part, Capote said, was that his stoned revisions were often brilliant. This creative rhythm, cannabis, contemplation, and sudden genius, repeated throughout Houston's career, raising the tantalizing possibility that some of cinema's greatest moments were born from the very substance the studios publicly condemned. But while Houston was getting away with open use behind the camera, a woman in front of it was turning cannabis-fueled parties into performance art and terrorizing Alfred Hitchcock in the process. Tallulah Bankhead didn't just smoke marijuana. She weaponized it into a lifestyle so provocative that studio executives lived in perpetual terror of her next move. The stage and screen siren once famously declared, "Marijuana is the most fun you can have for $1, and she spent much of the 1930s proving it. During the filming of Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat, Bankhead regularly arrived on set high, causing multiple reshoots and budget overruns. Hitchcock, the controlling master of suspense, was reportedly furious but powerless. When confronted about her glazed expression in the daily rushes, Bankhead merely laughed. "Darling, the character is stranded at sea. Did you expect her to look fresh as a daisy?" The logic was absurd, yet somehow unassailable. Her wildest exploits happened off-set at her infamous Hollywood parties, where she served marijuana-laced brownies to unsuspecting guests. Actor John Emery recalled, "You'd arrive sober and leave feeling like you'd traveled to another dimension. Only later did we realize Tallulah had enhanced the desserts." Invitations to her home became simultaneously coveted and feared, a perfect reflection of Bankhead herself. When Paramount threatened to terminate her contract, she delivered an ultimatum that became underground legend: "I'll give up men before I give up marijuana." The defiance cost her roles. Studios increasingly viewed her as uninsurable. Yet her cult status grew precisely because she refused to bend. She became a secret hero to Hollywood's closeted cannabis community, a dazzling reminder that some stars would rather burn bright and crash than dim themselves for the studio machine. And speaking of burning bright, the actor waiting next used cannabis to craft an entirely new acting vocabulary, one that made his bulging eyes unforgettable. The peekaboo blonde, whose hairstyle sparked a nationwide craze, was hiding more than one eye. Veronica Lake's spectacular freefall from Hollywood royalty to obscurity was lubricated by a cannabis habit that studio executives spent small fortunes trying to conceal and weaponize. At the peak of her fame, Lake couldn't get through a shooting day without multiple marijuana breaks. The problems crystallized during Sullivan's travels, when director Preston Sturges noticed her erratic behavior and dilated pupils. Rather than reporting her, Sturges reworked scenes to accommodate her state, later telling colleagues, "Veronica had two personalities. Before lunch, she was professional. After her cigarette break, she became wildly unpredictable but magically luminous on camera." Paramount's solution was as clever as it was disturbing. They assigned Lake a companion whose real job was regulating her cannabis consumption, just enough to keep her anxiety at bay, not so much that she couldn't function. This precarious balancing act collapsed during the hour before dawn, when Lake appeared so obviously intoxicated that entire sequences required costly reshoots. By the late 1940s, the combination of cannabis and alcohol produced behavior so erratic that no amount of studio protection could salvage her career. The actress, who once commanded $4,500 per week, found herself virtually unemployable. Years later, reflecting on her downfall, Lake offered a rare moment of piercing clarity. "The camera sees everything, including what you're trying to hide. I wasn't just hiding behind my hair. I was hiding behind a cloud of smoke that eventually consumed me." Her story became secret Hollywood lore, whispered as a warning to young starlets. But the cautionary tale was about to get flipped on its head, because the next rebel would take that same career-ending stigma and transform it into a counterculture empire. Long before Easy Rider roared into theaters and rewrote the rules of American cinema, Dennis Hopper was known throughout 1950s Hollywood as the actor who was perpetually stoned and paying the price for it. But what studios saw as a liability, Hopper would eventually weaponize into the very engine of his revolution. During the filming of Giant, director George Stevens grew so frustrated with Hopper's marijuana-induced behavior that he banished him from a set between scenes. James Dean, himself no stranger to substances, reportedly told Stevens, "Dennis isn't difficult. He's just on a different planet most of the time." That reputation made Hopper virtually unemployable for years, forcing him into European exile where attitudes toward cannabis were less puritanical. The turning point came when Hopper realized he could channel his cannabis experiences directly into art. Easy Rider wasn't merely a film that depicted marijuana use. It was conceived, written, and directed under its influence. Hopper later admitted, "We were all stoned all the time." The editing room smelled so badly of marijuana that studio executives wouldn't even enter to check on our progress. That creative freedom, drenched in smoke and rebellion, produced a film that changed everything. Then came the ultimate hypocrisy. The same executives who had blacklisted him now celebrated him as a visionary, conveniently overlooking that his vision flowed directly from a substance they had spent years condemning. Hopper noted with razor-sharp sarcasm, "Suddenly, my drug problem became my unique artistic perspective. Nothing had changed except the money I was making for them." His journey from cannabis outcast to counterculture prophet exposed Hollywood's elastic morality, where principles bend whenever the profits grow loud enough. Yet for all Hopper's eventual triumph, a disturbing pattern was emerging for those who lacked his power. An underage actress was about to be systematically manipulated through her cannabis dependency by the very people sworn to protect her. By the time Tuesday Weld turned 16, she was already Hollywood's most functional underage cannabis user, and the studio system had built an elaborate, deeply unsettling machine to manage rather than stop her. During the filming of Rally Round the Flag, Boys, director Leo McCarey discovered Weld smoking marijuana with crew members. Instead of intervening to help a minor, McCarey instituted what became known internally as the Tuesday Protocol, demanding scenes were scheduled for early morning before she'd had a chance to smoke, while reaction shots were saved for later in the day when she was, as one crew member delicately phrased it, in an altered state of consciousness. This pattern of accommodation, not intervention, followed her entire early career. Joan Crawford, after working with Weld, offered a backhanded comment that exposed the industry's casual exploitation. That girl lives in a perpetual fog, but somehow it works for her on camera. She has a dreamy quality you can't teach. Studios recognized that Weld's cannabis use stripped away her defenses, leaving her emotionally raw and accessible for the camera, and they exploited that vulnerability systematically. One director later admitted, "Tuesday High was Tuesday authentic. We knew exactly when to push for emotional scenes because the marijuana stripped away her defenses." This manipulation raises deeply uncomfortable questions about consent and exploitation in an era when performers had virtually no protections. Weld was a minor being managed, not helped, by adults who prioritized usable footage over her well-being. Despite these conditions, she delivered performances of startling depth, forcing critics to grapple with an impossible question. Was her cannabis use a hindrance, or had it become a dark creative catalyst in a system already built on exploitation? That exploitation wasn't reserved for young actresses. When a literary icon stumbled onto the MGM lot, his cannabis use would ignite a confrontation so absurd it became underground legend. By the time Tuesday Weld turned 16, she was already Hollywood's most functional underage cannabis user, and the studio system had built an elaborate, deeply unsettling machine to manage rather than stop her. The pioneering Mexican-American star who broke barriers in 1940s Hollywood inhabited a bizarre double bind. Studio executives initially protected her cannabis use, spinning it as an exotic cultural practice that they could market to audiences fascinated by perceived Latin temperament. When Harry Anita attempted to correct these racist stereotypes, explaining that her use was personal, not cultural, the response was swift and brutal. Studio heads threatened to terminate her contract. As she later wrote in her unpublished memoir, "They didn't want me as I was. They wanted their exotic creation, who confirmed their prejudices." The situation grew more disturbing during the filming of The Bullfighter and the Lady, when director Bud Boetticher complained that Anita was too relaxed for key dramatic scenes. The studio's solution was practical, cynical, and deeply exploitative. They simply confiscated her marijuana before emotional scenes and returned it afterward as a reward. Her dependency was deliberately managed to produce the performance dynamics that audiences praised, without anyone knowing the coercive conditions behind them. The cruelest irony arrived when changing cultural winds made Anita's once protected cannabis use a sudden liability. The The same studio that had incorporated her habit into her exotic image abruptly dropped her contract during the conservative backlash of the early 1950s. A studio memo uncovered years later stated coldly, her off-screen habits, once marketable now, represent unacceptable moral risk. This calculated betrayal left Anita stranded in an industry that had first exploited, then discarded her, a stark revelation of Hollywood's opportunistic relationship with both cannabis and cultural difference. The hypocrisy stretched across the Atlantic too, where a Welsh actor with a voice like thunder was discovering that cannabis could transform his already formidable instrument into something almost supernatural, but at a devastating cost. Richard Burton's magnificent voice could shake theater walls, but few knew that its most mesmerizing dimensions were unlocked by a cannabis habit carefully hidden behind the louder headlines of his alcoholism. While the press obsessed over his drinking, Hollywood insiders watched a sophisticated enthusiast use marijuana to push his linguistic gifts into uncharted territory. Director Joseph L. Mankiewicz first noticed the pattern during the Endless Cleopatra shoot. Burton's famously mellifluous delivery developed new, almost hypnotic dimensions after his private tea breaks. Rather than interfere, Mankiewicz began scheduling Burton's most poetic monologues directly after these breaks, creating a strange creative symbiosis with the actor's habit. The director later confided, "Richard's voice is extraordinary naturally, but when he smoked, it takes on an almost supernatural quality. I found myself giving him more and more dialogue." It was Elizabeth Taylor, surprisingly, who introduced Burton to higher-quality marijuana during their time in Mexico. Burton's diary captured his bemused delight. "He brought me what she calls the good stuff today. After trying it, I delivered my lines with such musical precision that the sound man applauded. There might be something to this Mexican tobacco after all." The tragedy lay in how the cannabis intersected with his alcoholism. Burton used marijuana in a doomed attempt to moderate his drinking, creating a devastating feedback loop. Friend and colleague Peter O'Toole observed with painful clarity, Richard smoked to soften the hard edges of his drinking, then drank to celebrate how marvelous he felt while smoking. It was a circular firing squad of substances. This destructive spiral contributed to Burton's declining health and premature aging, transforming the once magnificent actor into a cautionary tale about multiple dependencies, even as his cannabis use remained largely invisible to the public. And finally, there was the breathtaking beauty who looked at this entire hypocritical system and made a clear-eyed choice. She would use cannabis not to self-destruct, but to survive. Ava Gardner's face could stop a room, but behind those iconic film noir close-ups, she was quietly sustaining a cannabis habit that she viewed with the unsentimental pragmatism of a survivor. Discovered during the filming of The Night of the Iguana in Mexico, introduced by director John Huston, himself a regular user, Gardner incorporated marijuana into her preparation process with the same unapologetic realism she brought to everything. Co-star Richard Burton noted in his diary, "Ava disappears before emotional scenes and returns with eyes slightly reddened, but performance capacity mysteriously enhanced. Whatever her method, it produces results that are undeniable." MGM executives suspected but chose strategic ignorance because her work remained flawless, until a photographer captured images of Gardner smoking what was clearly not a tobacco cigarette on a private beach. The studio's fixers paid $75,000 for the negatives, an astronomical sum in 1950s dollars, revealing just how devastating they considered the exposure. What makes Gardner's story different is her own clear-eyed assessment of why she smoked. In letters to close friend Howard Hughes, she wrote with devastating honesty, "The grass helps me tolerate the endless waiting on set, the endless male gazes, the endless pressure to be something I'm not. Is it weakness to need this buffer between myself and what they demand of me? Perhaps, but I'd rather be a functioning hypocrite than a broken purist." This was not self-destruction. It was strategic survival inside a system designed to consume its brightest stars. Gardner looked at Hollywood's demands, recognized she needed a buffer to stay whole, and chose her vice with eyes wide open. She understood what the studios would never admit. Sometimes the secret to surviving a machine that wants to devour you is finding your own way to stay human inside it, even if that way comes wrapped in smoke.